For the first time in decades, Cubans are revolting against the communist government that rules over them. We'll have the full report for you tonight, and we'll also tell you how we're spinning this to make you think communism is good. But first, protesting impoverished conditions and a lack of freedom, Cubans storm the streets chanting freedom because they want to escape the massive oppression that comes with living under communism, as they're desperate for freedom. And many of the Cubans were waving American flags, a symbol of freedom. Meanwhile, in the US, Marxists who are trying to escape the hardships of living in freedom are burning American flags because they're desperate for communism. Back to Cuba. Heavily armed communist soldiers began attacking protesters who were not able to defend themselves against the tyrannical government because they banned guns in Cuba. This just in! And it's confirmed the far-left anti-Second Amendment advocates in the US have nothing to learn here. When people are oppressed and attacked by a tyrannical government, they're empowered by not being able to do anything about it. Guns aren't necessary. Trust us. But luckily, the communist government in Cuba began looking out for its people when it blocked internet and phone service to prevent more videos showing what's happening in Cuba from getting out to the world. How is the Biden administration, that also wants to disarm its citizens, responding? Well, by trying to hide the fact that Cubans are protesting communism. Instead, they're trying to convince the American public that Cuban citizens are protesting COVID cases. Which of course they are. Here you can see an unarmed woman after a communist soldier has beat her on behalf of COVID. As the Biden administration's pro-communism propaganda continued, White House official Julie Chung tweeted, "Peaceful protests are growing in Cuba as the Cuban people exercise their right to peacefully assemble to express concern about rising COVID cases." Nothing to see here, just a nation full of people loving communism while protesting COVID, trying to get the virus to change its policies. But Congressman Dan Crenshaw saw things differently as he responded to the White House official saying, "No, they're chanting libertad, which means freedom in Spanish. Stop playing cover for communists and support the Cuban people. My God, why is that so hard for you?" Well, Dan, critical race theory has it that the only reason why you're pointing out Julie Chung's lies is because she's of Asian descent. Would you be trying to expose the truth if Julie was a white woman? I don't think so. The Cuban people's desperate cries for an end to communist tyranny were also suppressed by fellow communist regime Twitter. Hashtag SOS Cuba was trending on Twitter, yet Twitter scrubbed any connection of it with the communist regime, instead only associating it with COVID. Twitter user Giancarlo had this to say in response to Twitter's propaganda. "This is ridiculous from Twitter. Yes, COVID cases are hitting an all-time high on the island, but we are demanding an end to the communist dictatorship." Well, I don't think he knows what's going on in Cuba. He's only Cuban. Maybe if he wasn't so xenophobic, he would know that all Cubans love communism. And you will too. Please vote Biden in 2024. If he's still kind of alive. And Senator Marco Rubio tweeted that Twitter is ignoring how the protests are really about socialism is a disaster and always leads to tyranny, despair, and suffering. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, those things sound pretty good to me. Don't you think, Bernie? And besides, Marco Rubio is part of the far-right hate group called the Republicans. You shouldn't listen to him. Instead, please surrender your freedom and pledge allegiance to the far-left hate group called Communism. Twitter is helping us understand that once again, it's in your best interest to let big tech do your thinking for you. This just in! After a couple days, the Biden administration has realized the American public, unfortunately, isn't dumb enough to fall for its attempt to cover up the horrors of communism. So in turn, while taking a break from trying to read off teleprompters to try to read off a paper in front of them instead, Biden had this to say.
As they assert their universal rights, and we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
And also, watch White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki say this, while carefully avoiding any mention of the word communism.
There's every indication that yesterday's protests were spontaneous expressions of people who are exhausted with the Cuban government's economic mismanagement and repression.
Oh, never mind. I guess the Biden administration does still think the American public's dumb enough to fall for its attempt to cover for communism. Are they watching their words carefully so down the line when they're running a communist regime, there's no record of them speaking negatively about communism? Oh, it says don't say that. Cool, my bad. I won't. If you've studied history, then you'd know communism works until you implement it. And then it's oppression, poverty, and starvation for the population controlled by it. Overhearing this information, it's rumored a Biden official responded saying, "Correct. That's exactly what happens. So what do you mean it doesn't work?" So in conclusion to tonight's story, please pay no attention to how we're not praising the brave, freedom-loving people of Cuba for standing up against the communist regime that's ruled over them in the name of their God-given freedom. Because here at the mainstream media, doing so could set back the agenda we're a part of by many years, and that wouldn't benefit anybody other than the public. So please choose obedience over bravery. And that's it for tonight's report on the Cuban communist protests. Please tune in tomorrow night where we'll continue indoctrinating you into how to complain about your freedom so you'll welcome communism in with open arms. Tomorrow's episode will be brought to you by BLM with special guests AOC and Bernie Sanders. Should be good. Good night!